Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into a really fascinating framework, one that claims to have a single, unified answer for some of the biggest questions we all ask about life.
I mean, have you ever just looked around at the world and wondered, why? Why is there so much suffering, so much conflict? What's going on with all the challenges we face as, a human family? Well, believe it or not, a text by a Colombian philosopher named Gerardo Schmedling says all those big questions, they actually have one single interconnected answer. So in this explainer, we're going to unpack the core ideas from his pretty unique framework called the Sociology of Evolution. All right, so how does this whole thing work? It's basically built on four main pillars. We're going to look at the four laws, then the 7 levels of consciousness, a really interesting choice between being and not being, and finally some practical rules for harmony. Let's jump right in. Okay, first up, the 4 fundamental laws. Now, according to the framework, these are basically the invisible rules that govern our entire reality. So these 4 laws aren't just, a random list. They actually form a hierarchy. It's best to think of it like a pyramid. You've got 3 laws that form the base. These are the ones that govern our day-to-day lives. But then, sitting right at the top, you have this one master law, the law of evolution. And it influences everything else below it. So what are these laws exactly? Well, first you have the law of nature. That's what governs the physical world, our bodies, all that stuff. Then there's the law of harmony, which is all about our psychological state and our relationships. And the third one, the law of correspondence, basically makes sure our life experiences and circumstances are perfectly tailored for our own learning. But here's where it gets really interesting. That 4th law, evolution, is like the master program. See, when we violate one of those first 3 laws, and we experience suffering as a result, the framework says it's not a punishment. No, it's actually the law of evolution stepping in to create a specific lesson for us so we can grow. Okay, so if the whole point of life is to learn and evolve, then what does that journey actually look like? That brings us right to the second big pillar of this framework, the 7 levels of consciousness. The central idea here is pretty cool. It's that our consciousness isn't some static, fixed thing. It's actually a journey, always moving upwards, kind of like climbing a spiral staircase. And according to this text, each level on that spiral has its own unique vibratory frequency, or you could say its own worldview. You start with these really dense, limited perspectives down at the bottom, and you move all the way up toward enlightened wisdom at the very top. And you can really see that progression here. The whole journey kicks off at these lower levels, which are pretty much dominated by ignorance and, ego-driven conflict. But as consciousness starts to climb, society itself actually evolves right along with it. We move from things like monetary control to community cooperation and loyalty, and eventually up toward states of perfect harmony, peace, and what the text calls pure love. It's a really clear path from being self-centered to being of service. So if we're all on this big evolutionary journey, how do we actually move up that spiral? Well, the framework says it all boils down to a single constant choice that we're making in every single moment. And that's the choice between what it calls being and not being. So picture your consciousness for a second, like a fork in the road. Information you process can come from one of 2 places. The first path, that comes from your intuitive, wise self. That's what the text calls ser, which just means being. But the other path, that comes from your reactive mind, the part of you that gets tangled up in judgment and fear. And that's called no ser, or not being. So on one side, you've got the state of being. This is where you find wisdom, peace, and intuition. It's when you act spontaneously, in a state of harmony. But on the other side, that's not being, and that's the ego's playground. It's totally driven by fear, and it leads to all those automatic negative reactions that, create pretty much all our conflict and suffering. And this, right here, this is really the core diagnosis of the entire framework. I mean, it's a huge claim that all suffering, and we're talking everything from a tiny frustration to a massive global conflict, it all stems from this one single internal mistake, choosing to operate from that reactive state of not being. Okay, so how do we actually choose being? How do we escape that cycle of suffering? The great thing is, the framework doesn't just leave us with a theory. It brings us to our final pillar, a really practical set of rules for harmony. And these rules are split very logically into two parts. But notice the order, because it's super important. First, you work on your inner peace. This is all about radical acceptance, taking life as it comes, accepting people as they are, just being yourself. And only after you've built that solid inner foundation can you really create outer peace. And you do that by not creating resistance and by earning confidence, love, and respect through your actions, not by demanding them.
So when you put it all together, this framework really challenges our most basic assumption about hardship. It suggests that maybe nothing is random, that maybe every single difficulty we face is a perfectly designed lesson just for us. And that leaves us with a really provocative question to think about. Is the suffering in your own life just a random, meaningless accident, or could it actually be a purposeful, maybe even a loving mechanism designed for your own growth?